Hi everyone, this is Axel from dreamsanctuary.net. I'm here with another interesting and hopefully useful dream to present, so let's get straight to it. As usual, we will follow the 6-step method of the dream guide available on my website. You can refresh your memory if you need to. Here's the dream. I had it in March 2024 and I called it the post-human condition. Jung told me about a painting in his Red Book where, at the end of the tail of a large flying dragon, you could see a human doing an Ouroboros with his own fire. Basically, the man was eating a fire that belonged to him, like the Ouroboros itself. I'm not sure if I heard this in the dream or when I woke up, but 3 things immediately came to mind. Wotan, the post-human condition, and the quote, "We must turn his own weapons against him." Let's go to the key symbols and their associations. The first symbol is Jung, and for me it's the wise old man. The wise old man is the personification of a masculine spirit of meaning. So the spirit of meaning from the unconscious takes the shape of Jung and come to tell me something about his Red Book, and that's something that is true or operative for the psyche. Next we have the Ouroboros, and the Ouroboros is something like the act of recreating one's potential. You consume and regenerate yourself at the same time. Fire is the libido, and next Wotan and this post-human condition go together. So Wotan is the spirit that is guiding a quote-unquote new human development leading to the post-human condition. And the post-human condition is a mode of being whose prime example would be Christ after his resurrection. Finally, we have "We must turn his own weapons against him." That's a quote from the Phenomenology of the Spirit in Fairy Tales, collected work 9.1. And the full quote goes like this. "The fairy tale makes it clear that it is possible for a man to attain totality, to become whole only with the cooperation of the spirit of darkness. Indeed, that the latter is actually a causa instrumentalis of redemption and individuation. In utter perversion of this goal of spiritual development, to which all nature aspires and which is also prefigured in Christian doctrine, National Socialism destroyed man's moral autonomy and set up the nonsensical totalitarianism of the state. The fairy tale tells us how to proceed if we want to overcome the power of darkness. We must turn his own weapons against him, which naturally cannot be done if the magical underworld of the hunter remains unconscious, and if the best men in the nation would rather preach dogmatisms and platitudes than take the human psyche seriously." As I understand this quote, the magical underworld of the hunter is the unconscious, and Jung tells us that this can be weaponized as a tool to control, or it can be used as an agent of transformation. See, movements in the unconscious are like waves. If they're not properly understood or accounted for, they can overwhelm and drown people, leading them to act in the most absurd manner. But if they are understood consciously, in an appropriate manner, it allows the individual to gather momentum towards wholeness. And this is what I mean by the quote-unquote new development that the spirit of Wotan made sensible. It's that National Socialism was essentially a collective individuation. But there's a huge but here. Collective individuation, especially with such a totalitarian dimension, is not the same as personal individuation. In fact, I would argue they have very little in common. And so this is where I'm coming from, that in my understanding, what National Socialism attempted to do is to propose a collective model towards individuation. This might explain the fascination that some people have towards the magical or esoteric dimension of that political movement. But this is not any form of approval of what happened. I want to make crystal clear that any project resembling collective individuation must be rejected without a second thought. They are, as Jung calls it, perversions of a prefigured religious and natural goal, namely the emphasis on individual existence, autonomy, responsibility, and ethos. Here's a quote from collected work 14. "The real carrier of life is the individual. Anyone, therefore, who thinks in terms of men minus the individual is infected with the leprosy of collective thinking and has become an inmate of the totalitarian state." Those are some pretty strong words here, but what it means is that collective thinking must be rejected in favor of taking each individual separately. And I feel like I have to go even harder at this idea of collective individuation. From what I just said previously, It should be clear that I see collective individuation as a peril for any ideologies. But there's a real danger, and a great irony I might add, that this is how people will be misusing Jung's work. I mean, you can read the collected works backwards and frontwards, memorize everything that has been written on the unconscious, make fourfold schemes all day or take inspirations from alchemical recipes, and yet it will never get you close to the needs of the individual psyche. And it's not like no good at all can come out of it, but collective individuation will never get people there. It can only fail. To add to this, I'm very well aware of the spellbinding nature of Jung's work. I know it can enchant people and rob them of their personal autonomy and ideas as they lose themselves in his works. I understand that. I'm also aware that even my work here on YouTube or on my website is at the risk of becoming something like collective individuation. And yet this is not something I can fully prevent. Anyway, I want to put this problem behind me with some self-awareness. So I am going to attempt to put this to rest with two relevant quotes. First one is from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. In many cases in psychiatry, the patient who comes to us has a story that is not told, and which as a rule no one knows of. To my mind, therapy only really begins after the investigation of that wholly personal story. It is the patient's secret, the rock against which he is shattered. If I know his secret story, I have a key to the treatment. The doctor's task is to find out how to gain that knowledge. In most cases, exploration of the conscious material is insufficient. Sometimes an association test can open the way, so can the interpretation of dreams, or long and patient human contact with the individual. In therapy, the problem is always the whole person, never the symptom alone. We must ask questions which challenge the whole personality. There's so much to say in a quote like this. I would like to emphasize that therapy, or at least analytical psychology, only really begins when the wholly personal story is confronted. That's the thing that ejects the individual from all collective at once. There's nothing like it anywhere else. It is utterly unique and thus utterly unknown. It becomes comprehensible only with a sustained and prolonged effort. And Jung writes, this is a secret. It's not known by anyone, and it's far from conscious access. It's only revealed unpredictably, sometimes through work in depth, sometimes through exceptional life events. And finally, this secret, what some people call the personal myth, is not something victorious, but the rock against which the individual is continuously shattered. To know one's personal myth comes with reluctance and honestly some horror. Learning about it won't make you believe it. Only a living experience can convince you, step by step, that this is where the safe road ends and where the forest must be entered alone. Another useful quote on the topic of collective individuation against personal individuation would be that neurosis, Jung said, in the nearest he came to a definitive definition, is the suffering of a soul that has not found its meaning. After this lengthy aside, let's go back to the dream. My personal context was that I was in a very tense moving out situation. Our tenancy was terminated, leaving 1 month to find a new place. And among packing boxes around my 2 kids, we visited a lot of places and found something only 1 week before the moving out date. And I've moved 10 times in my life, and this is unheard of, 1 month to do all this work. So on an emotional level, I was feeling exhausted, as if I was on the receiving end of an unjust, unfair situation. Everything was taking place as fast as possible, and it could be done only one way, at the last minute. Now, if we look back at the dream from a feeling standpoint, I see 3 distinct moments. The first one would be the setting, with the wise old man, the spirit of meaning in the Red Book. And here I feel that there's something true, something operative. Then there's the large dragon, the fire, the human, the Ouroboros, and there's a feeling of awe. And also I feel the large movement of the dragon, as well as the smaller movement of the human and his fire doing this transmutation thing. And finally, the last moment is Wotan, post-human condition, and the quote. And here I feel like I have an insight. Those are the keys to fully unlock the dream. So all of that allows me to propose the following interpretation, that I'm being presented with something true on how to work with the psyche. And it's really the position of the man at the end of the tale. And it's like being at the end of a process of a large flying dragon. So what's left is for the man to eat his own fire, to recreate himself like an Ouroboros. This is said to be the new human condition. And I see this as a form of affirming life or affirming the psyche, because it requires changing oneself and not the world. So it's not a matter of changing the situation, which is the large flying dragon, but you transmute the libido so that one can accept the situation as it is required. We don't change the situation, we change ourselves. This makes a lot of sense regarding my personal context. In one way, the situation went perfectly. And yet, from the perspective of the insecure ego, it never felt like anything was going well. So maybe that's the situation I am in. I'm in this large flying great dragon, and it is my role as a responsible ego to recalibrate myself by making proper use of the fire. Is this a new human condition? The question remains open for contemplation. Quickly through the checklist, you can see I'm taking this dream symbolically, and it does teach me something new, or rather it constellates elements I knew about in a novel and fresh manner. And does the interpretation feel self-congratulatory? Absolutely not. This is quite difficult to stomach for the ego to be responsible to do all the transmutation, to have to work on will and not on the situation at large. And finally, does the interpretation teach something about the outer world or the inner world? Well, it teaches what attitude to take to face the world. It's primarily an inner world thing. This interpretation is the way I ended up revisiting this moving out process. I ask myself questions like, did everything go well? Did I worry too much? Was there something I could have done better? And to all those questions, the answer is that everything went fine. The new place exceeds my expectations. The moving process went well. Nothing went overboard, despite me being constantly worried and insecure. So there's a change of attitude that I have to do moving forward, which is from forcing my will to adapting to what's happening, and from reacting to allowing things. In a bit of a trite manner, I would say I'm learning to trust the process, but there's nothing passive or lazy about this. I'm working hard on different levels, at the unconscious level, at the feeling level, and at the outer world level, at the social level as well, to make sure everything is going well. What I'm trying is to transmute the worry and the insecurity so I can take the leap of faith. To expand on this idea of the large dragon and the human fire, I'd like to talk about this old Yiddish saying, man plans, God laughs, or the Woody Allen version. If you want to make God laugh, tell him about your plans. If we take this quote away from its metaphysical understanding to an existential understanding, what does this mean? Well, it means that reality is infinitely complex, at least compared to what the ego can understand and account for. And so if reality is infinitely complex, the future is infinitely complex. That follows logically. So if we have a vision of the future, it's at best a leap of faith, and at worst, an entrapment of what reality can or could be. We're projecting what we think should happen onto something infinitely complex, and we say, this is how I want it to look like. When we do something like this, we claim omniscience. This is why God laughs. What we do, in fact, is we confuse the local space, so the ego needs and the ego's territory, and the transcendent space, so reality as such, in its infinitely complex dimension. And so we say the transcendent space must conform to our local space. So that's completely preposterous to claim omniscience like this. And, sometimes it does work, but sometimes the transcendent space will push back against the will of the ego about this vision of what the future should be. And this is something that will make sense to some people and absolutely none to others. But have you ordered something online and it never comes, even when you complain to the customer service? Or maybe you want to go to a special place and for some reason, just at that moment, it's closed. Or you want to distract yourself with a movie, internet, a game, but the software keeps crashing, it cannot be started, or internet goes out. Maybe you want to order something not really healthy and something wrong happens to the order. Or I don't know, you send an important email and it never arrives. Or you have an important meeting to attend and something goes strangely wrong on that day, forcing you to cancel. I'm not just talking here about swimming against the current, but there's a very uncanny element to this. It's like there's a goal, and every time you step towards that goal, the goal shifts. The horizon that you're aiming at moves every time you make an attempt to get closer. This has happened to me more than a few times, and it's really not comfortable to be prevented to make what seems to be reasonable decisions. So I'm asking you again, what do you do when the transcendent space pushes back on the will of the ego? Well, passivity is no solution, so we need to act. My solution is to make a bad plan, and as this plan comes into contact with the present, I let things be reorganized, reprioritized by taking cues from those mostly non-verbal situational events I'm talking about. Because I'm used to it, I know when I'm entering this twilight zone where things either go very well or very poorly, and from that I completely reorganize this bad plan I have. And just for clarity, what I mean by a bad plan is something I really can't shake off. I base a bad plan on something I'm avoiding and I need to structure it through the day. I still need to act. I'm not going to wait for things to fall on my lap. A more extreme case of the transcendent space pushing back, this failure of the will, is the conflict without issue. There's a lengthy quote by Marie-Louise von Franz that is on this topic, and so I would like to read it. Jung has said that to be in a situation where there is no way out, or to be in a conflict where there is no solution, is the classical beginning to the process of individuation. It is meant to be a situation without solution. The unconscious wants the hopeless conflict in order to put ego consciousness up against the wall, so that the man has to realize that whatever it does is wrong, whichever way he decides will be wrong. This is meant to knock out the superiority of the ego, which always acts from the illusion that it has the responsibility of decision. Naturally, if a man says, "Oh well, then I shall just let everything go and make no decision and just protract and wriggle out of it," the whole thing is equally wrong, for then naturally nothing happens. But if he is ethical enough to suffer to the core of his personality, because of the insolubility of the conscious situation, the self manifests. In religious language, you could say that the situation without issue is meant to force the man to rely on an act of God. In psychological language, the situation without issue, which the anima arranges with great skill in a man's life, is meant to drive him into a condition in which he is capable of experiencing the self. When thinking of the anima as the soul guide, we are apt to think of Beatrice leading Dante up to paradise. But we should not forget that he experienced that only after he had gone through hell. Normally, the anima does not take a man by the hand and lead him right up to paradise. She puts him first into a hot cauldron where he is nicely roasted for a while. So the point of this quote is that if you are in a case like this, a conflict without issue, one must open oneself to something greater than the ego's will or current worldview. What can provide a way out is dreams or synchronistic phenomena. It's worth trying, but there is never a guarantee. I would like to finish this video with a remarkable letter Jung wrote that can be found in Aspects of Jung's Personality and Work by Gerhard Hadler. It goes like this. In a letter of 1926, Jung writes, "The problem of crucifixion is the beginning of individuation. There is the secret meaning of the Christian symbolism, a path of blood and suffering, like any other step forward on the road of the evolution of human consciousness. Can man stand a further increase of consciousness? Is it really worthwhile that man should progress morally and intellectually? Is that gain worth the candle? That's the question. I don't want to force my views on anybody else, but I must confess that I submitted to the divine power of this apparently unsurmountable problem, and I consciously and intentionally made my life miserable, because I wanted God to be alive and free from the suffering man has put on him by loving his own reason more than God's secret intentions." And I'm skipping a bit here. Try to apply seriously what I've told you. Not that you might escape suffering, nobody can escape it, but that you may avoid the worst, blind suffering. A quote like this makes me ask myself, are we loving our own reason, or maybe our own will more than we should? And is this possible that this is causing suffering to God's secret intention? And if I refer back to my dream, is it justifiable to say that this large flying dragon is this autonomous quality of God's secret intention? If that's the case, then what's left? what's left is for me to transmute my own will, something that undoubtedly caused a great deal of suffering and misery. But as it is argued here, I believe that voluntary and conscious suffering is still a better deal than blind suffering. I hope this video is useful to people who are having a tough time and are being continuously cornered into impossible situations. You might want to consider that you are into a carefully designed conflict without issue, whose goal is to force the ego to let go of a willpower that is too rigid and come in contact with the unconscious as a creative source for solving problems. It happened to me, and that was my way out. Thank you for your attention, and until the next one.